The sun was setting low over the dusty plains when Elijah Wade rode back into town. His horse was limping, his hat covered in trail dust, and the ache in his chest was heavier than the saddle he'd carried for days. He wasn't a man given to stopping, but tonight the emptiness of his land, the silence of his ranch, had begun to claw at his bones. So when he saw the crowd gathered outside the saloon, the laughter, the shouting, the unmistakable sound of a man making a deal, he tied his reins to the post and walked in without a word. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and smoke hit him like a storm. Men crowded around a table, slamming coins, playing cards, and yelling over one another. But in the corner, under a flickering oil lamp, stood something that made every sound in the room fade, a woman. Not just any woman, she was standing tall, her wrists bound with a soft rope, her dark hair tangled from travel, her eyes burning like fire against the dull air of the saloon. The man beside her, a trader from the border, shouted, "She's worth every damn dollar. A fine woman, strong, loyal, and quiet if you treat her right." Elijah froze, disgusted at first. He'd seen men buy horses, cattle, even land. But this was something else. Yet when the woman's eyes met his, he saw no shame. Only defiance. A strength that told him she wasn't broken, just trapped. She looked right at him and said, voice trembling but proud, "If you're going to stand there staring, then walk away. But if you pay, make it mean something." The room went silent. The trader laughed. "You heard her, cowboy. 500 and she's yours." Elijah's fingers moved on instinct, reaching for the pouch at his belt. He hadn't meant to, but something in her tone cut deeper than anything he'd heard in years. The coins hit the table one by one, ringing through the silence. Men muttered, someone spat, the trader grinned wide, untied her wrists, and shoved her toward Elijah. "You paid for her, she's yours." She stumbled into him, her small frame hitting his chest. Elijah steadied her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her pulse raced under his hand. "You paid," she whispered, eyes locked on his. "Now do it." He didn't understand what she meant, not yet. But he felt something shift inside him. He led her out of the saloon as the laughter behind them grew louder. Outside, the desert wind howled and lifted her hair like black fire in the moonlight. She turned to him, shivering slightly, and said softly, "You're not like them. I saw it in your eyes. But you can't save me unless you act like one of them, at least tonight." They reached his horse. He lifted her gently into the saddle, then mounted behind her, his arms instinctively circling her waist. She didn't resist. The warmth of her body pressed against his chest, the rhythm of her breathing faint under the rustle of her dress. "What's your name?" he asked over the wind. "Lila," she said after a pause. "My people called me something else once, but that's gone now." When they reached the ranch, the night had gone cold and still. The house stood empty, no light, no sound, just the echo of the wind through the wooden boards. Elijah pushed open the door, and the two of them stepped inside. She looked around, her eyes catching the single lantern on the table, the half-empty bottle, the untouched bed in the corner. "So this is where you live," she said softly. "A man with no one. And now, you've bought yourself company." Her tone wasn't cruel, it was tired, broken, but edged with truth. Elijah didn't argue. He set his hat down, lit the lantern, and said quietly, "You don't owe me anything, Lila. I just couldn't leave you there." But she shook her head, stepping closer until he could feel her breath on his collar. "No," she said, voice trembling. "You don't understand. If I don't give them what they think you paid for, they'll come back. They'll take me again, and you'll be next." He met her eyes, saw the fear buried deep inside. "Then we'll make them believe," she whispered. "You paid for me, now do it." The air between them turned heavy, the silence louder than thunder. Elijah swallowed hard, his heart pounding as she lifted her chin, defiant and desperate all at once. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and in that single touch realized, this wasn't about possession. It was about protection. The world outside that door was ruthless. But inside this house, she wasn't property. She was safe. Outside, the wind screamed across the plains, carrying with it the sound of distant laughter from the town. Inside, the flame flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, as two lost souls stood face to face, both bound by a deal neither of them truly understood. Yet somehow, in that silence, something real began to form, something neither of them had expected. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's shutters, painting pale lines across the wooden floor. Elijah Wade sat by the dying fire, his hat tilted low, the smell of smoke and cold ash mixing with the faint scent of her hair still lingering in the air. Lila slept in his bed, the first person to sleep there in 3 winters. He hadn't closed his eyes all night. He'd sat there, listening to the wind, the creak of the old house, and the rhythm of her breathing. Every time he looked at her, something inside him twisted, not in guilt, but in the strange, new ache of belonging. When she finally stirred, her dark eyes opened slowly, cautious, like a wild creature waking in a trap. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she sat up, the blanket sliding off her shoulders, and whispered, "You didn't touch me." Elijah turned his gaze away, stoking the fire. "I said I wouldn't," he replied quietly. "You were safe here." Lila watched him, her expression unreadable. "Then why pay?" she asked. "Men don't throw away silver for mercy." Elijah didn't answer right away. He poured her some coffee, weak, bitter, but warm, and said finally, "Because I've seen too many people treated like things. I'm done standing by." She took the cup, her hands trembling. For the first time, her eyes softened. "No one's ever said that to me," she murmured. "Not since my husband died." Elijah's head turned slowly. "Your husband?" She nodded, staring into the flames. "He was Apache. We had a small home in the canyon, before soldiers came. They said we stole horses, said we killed white men. Lies. They burned everything." Her voice cracked. "He died trying to save me. I've been running ever since. That traitor found me outside Santa Fe, said he'd take me to safety. Instead, he sold me." Elijah clenched his jaw, the muscles in his arms tightening. "If he comes looking for you, I'll be waiting." Lila looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she smiled, just a faint curve of her lips. "You talk like a man who means it," she said softly. "But you don't know what kind of danger you just brought into your life." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the horizon. The plains stretched endless, pale gold under the morning sun. "Danger's been here long before you," he said. "You just gave it a reason to make sense." That day, they worked side by side. Elijah showed her how to gather kindling, how to saddle a horse, how to move quiet through the brush. She watched him with cautious trust, her movements graceful, measured. When he caught her staring, she looked away quickly, pretending to study the land. But something in her eyes said what words wouldn't. Gratitude, and something else, deeper, unnamed. By noon, the wind carried dust and the sound of hooves. Elijah froze, hand reaching for his rifle. Lila went pale. "It's him," she whispered. "The traitor." 3 men rode up the trail, their horses snorting, rifles slung over their backs. The traitor, thick-bearded, mean-eyed, shouted from the gate, "Wade. You've got something that ain't yours." Elijah stepped out of the barn, calm but steady, rifle in hand. "She's not a thing," he said flatly. "You sold her. You're done here." The traitor spat into the dirt. "That money was for her. Not her freedom. You think one night makes her yours." Behind Elijah, Lila stepped out slowly, her hair whipping in the wind. "He didn't buy me," she said, voice firm. "He saved me. That's more than any man ever did for you." The traitor's grin twisted. "Then I'll take back what's mine, and the fool who thinks he's her hero." He reached for his gun. The next second cracked through the air like thunder. Elijah's rifle barked once, clean and sharp. The traitor fell from his horse, the others bolting in panic. The silence that followed was heavier than the shot itself. Elijah lowered his weapon slowly, breathing hard. Lila ran to him, her hands trembling as they touched his arm. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "Some things you finish, or they come back worse." She stared at him, her lips trembling. Then she whispered, "You didn't just save me, Elijah. You bound yourself to me. In my people's way, that means we are one." He blinked, not sure what to say. "You mean," she nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "You paid for me, but you earned me by what you did. You are my husband now, if you'll have me." For the first time in years, Elijah smiled, small, quiet, but real. He reached out, brushing her cheek with his calloused hand. "Then I reckon I already do." Outside, the wind softened. The world seemed to hold its breath. 2 broken lives had found something neither thought they'd ever have again, not a deal, not a debt, but a choice. And somewhere beyond the plains, the sound of horses faded into nothing, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the beginning of something sacred. Weeks passed after that shot echoed across the plains, but its shadow never truly left the ranch. The traitor's blood had long dried into the earth, yet every time the wind blew from the south, Elijah felt the ghosts of consequence stirring in the dust. Still, he and Lila had built something, fragile but real. They worked together, spoke little, and moved as though they'd known each other for years. The land began to look alive again, the fences stood straight, the barn smelled of hay instead of rot, and the silence between them had changed from lonely to peaceful. Each morning, she rose before him, the soft scrape of her feet on the wooden floor waking him before dawn. He'd find her outside, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, whispering something in Apache to the sunrise, a prayer, a greeting, or maybe just a memory. He never asked what it meant. He just watched, his heart quiet and full, knowing he'd never again see beauty as fierce and calm as that. They shared meals at the same worn table, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the wind. Lila learned his land, the way to mend fences, milk the cows, plant seeds before the frost. Elijah learned her silence, when to leave her alone, when to hold her hand without saying a word. The scars on her spirit were deep, but the earth around them seemed to heal as she did. Then, one evening as the sky bled gold and red, a rider appeared on the ridge, the shape of a man against the fire-colored horizon. Elijah went still. He knew that kind of stance, the straight back, the slow, deliberate hand near the gun. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. Lila stepped beside him, her eyes narrowing. "That's no traitor. That's a scout." The rider dismounted near the fence, his voice sharp as flint. "You Wade." Elijah nodded. "Name's Finch. Marshal out of Abilene. You're harboring a runaway native. Word is, a man died over her. You know anything about that?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Man tried to sell her," he said. "Got what he earned." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't matter what he earned. What matters is law, and law says she goes back." Lila stepped forward before Elijah could speak. "Back where?" she said, her tone low but steady. "Back to chains. Back to men who think they can sell me twice." The marshal looked taken aback. "Lady, I don't make the laws." "No," she said softly, "you just follow them. Even when they're wrong." Elijah could feel the storm brewing in her voice, the same fierce pride that had burned the night he first saw her. He stepped between them. "Marshal," he said, calm but cold, "you ride back and tell whoever sent you this, she's my wife now. Bought her, freed her, married her. You want to test that, you'll need more than a badge." The silence that followed stretched like barbed wire. The marshal studied Elijah's eyes, saw the truth there, and finally spat into the dirt. "You're a fool, Wade," he muttered. "But a brave one." Then he mounted his horse, turned, and rode off into the fading sun. Lila's knees nearly gave out when he was gone. Elijah caught her before she fell, holding her close. She trembled against his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of freedom finally realized. "He won't come back," Elijah whispered. "Not him, not anyone." Tears traced down her cheeks. "You said I was safe," she whispered. "You made it true." That night, they sat by the fire again, like that first night, but this time different. No deals, no pretense, no shadow of dead between them. Lila placed her hand over his and said quietly, "Where I come from, a man who saves a woman's life becomes part of her spirit. Even death can't unbind it." Elijah looked at her, eyes soft beneath the brim of his hat. "Then I guess I'm not planning to die anytime soon." She smiled, truly smiled this time, and leaned into him. The firelight flickered across their faces, warm and golden, while outside, the wind carried only the quiet hum of peace. In the weeks that followed, people began to talk about the rancher who lived with the Apache woman. Some called him mad, others called him brave. Elijah didn't care either way. The fields grew greener, the nights warmer, and for the first time in his life, he didn't wake up to silence, he woke up to her. He'd paid a price once, not in silver, but in courage. And in return, he hadn't just bought freedom. He'd found love in a world that had forgotten what it meant. And so, as the seasons turned and the land healed around them, the legend of the man who paid for a woman and ended up with a wife spread across the plains, not as a story of shame, but as a rare, fragile kind of redemption that only the Wild West could forge. Winter came early that year. The land that once shimmered gold beneath the sun was now buried in frost, its silence broken only by the creak of frozen wood and the groan of the wind against the cabin walls. Elijah stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass, watching the snow gather against the corral fence. Behind him, the fire glowed low, and Lila's soft hum filled the room, an Apache lullaby she said was meant to keep spirits warm in the cold. The months had changed them both. Elijah was no longer the quiet rancher who kept to himself. He was a man who smiled more easily, who spoke to the land as though it listened. Lila had found peace in the work, feeding the animals, tending the fire, sewing by the light of the lamp. Yet in her eyes, Elijah sometimes saw something else, a shadow she couldn't shake. That morning, she paused her song and said softly, "The land remembers blood, Elijah. Even when snow covers it." He turned from the window. "You mean the traitor?" She nodded slowly. "Men like him don't die alone. Someone always comes looking." Her words lingered like smoke. Elijah tightened his jaw but said nothing. He went to check the barn, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm, the same unease gnawing at him that had haunted him since the marshal's visit. He'd learned long ago, peace in the west was just a pause between storms. By dusk, the first sign appeared, distant hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable. Lila stepped onto the porch beside him, her shawl whipping in the wind. 3 riders emerged from the ridge, their outlines dark against the snow. Elijah cursed under his breath. "Bounty men," he muttered. Lila's voice was steady. "They came for me." "No," Elijah said firmly, checking his rifle. "They'll have to go through me first." The riders dismounted near the fence. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, shouted, "We're looking for an Apache woman. Name's Lila. Heard she's hiding out here." Elijah stepped forward into the snow, rifle in hand. "Ain't no one hiding," he said. "You're trespassing. Turn around." The man grinned. "You the one who killed Jasper Haynes?" "Wasn't murder," Elijah said coldly. "It was justice." The bounty hunter's grin widened. "Justice don't pay. Dead or alive does." The next moment split the world open. The first shot came from the ridge, sparking against the barn door. Elijah dropped to one knee, returning fire, his rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. Lila screamed his name, then vanished into the cabin. The battle roared through the snow, echoes bouncing off the hills. 2 men fell before they reached the fence, but the third fired wild, his bullet tearing through the window behind Elijah. Inside, glass shattered. Lila cried out. He ran, heart pounding, into the cabin. She was on the floor, clutching her shoulder, blood seeping through her fingers. "Lila," he gasped, dropping beside her. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered, pain clouding them. "You said I was safe," she whispered, her breath shallow. "You still are," he said, pressing his coat against the wound. "No one takes you, not while I'm breathing." He stormed back outside, rage burning through the cold. The last bounty man tried to reload, but Elijah's shot struck first, clean, final. The man fell, the snow beneath him blooming red. When silence returned, Elijah staggered back inside. Lila was pale but conscious, the blood slowing. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking. "You're gonna be all right," he said, his voice breaking. She smiled faintly, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You fight like my husband did," she murmured. "Only difference is, you survived." "Don't talk like that," he said fiercely. "You're not leaving me." Her hand trembled against his face. "Elijah, if I don't make it." He shook his head. "No, you'll promise me something." "What?" "That you'll keep this land alive. Because if it lives, I live too." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You're not dying," he whispered. "You hear me, you're not." She closed her eyes, her breath faint but steady. Hours passed, the fire dwindling, until dawn finally broke through the frosted window. Elijah hadn't moved. He sat beside her, holding her hand, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in. When her eyes opened again, weak but clear, he let out a breath that felt like release. "You stubborn woman," he said softly. "I told you," she whispered, voice thin but smiling. "The land remembers life too." He laughed, tears freezing on his cheeks. Outside, the snow began to melt, a slow thaw that seemed almost merciful. The bounty men were buried before noon, their graves marked by nothing but silence. As the sun rose higher, Elijah carried her outside, wrapping her in his coat. Together they stood, looking over the land they'd fought for, bruised, blood-stained, but theirs. And as the wind brushed her hair and the sky turned clear blue, she said quietly, "You paid for me once, Elijah, but what we have now, we earned." He looked at her, eyes soft and full of the kind of love that only comes after loss, and said, "Then it's worth everything I had."